It's time to do an upgrade. This is part one of the full upgrade process for the Masuter Pro and Masuter 3 benchtop CNC by Fox Alien. This full process actually took about 3 hours, but with video production time added, it probably should only take you somewhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours. This is a significant upgrade to the original machine. It raises the XZ axis by about an inch and a half, stiffens the machine, and changes out the grossly underpowered open loop Nema 17 steppers to the open loop Nema 23 steppers. The new controller is also significantly larger and will take a lot more space, so be prepared for that too. I pre-disassembled my Masuter Pro spoil board, moved the machine to a location where I could more easily access all the sides of the machine. So all that being said, I also recommend you should change out all your wheels and all your belts while you're in this process. You already have the machine completely disassembled. It's the perfect time to do it. I will leave links to a good set of wheels and the belts that I really think work great with this machine down in the description. Also, I should note this upgrade is about $399 US at the time I recorded this, and this was not provided to me by the company. I actually purchased this myself, knowing that my machine needed this upgrade. I actually was having problems with my current machine. I had used it well beyond its capabilities to the point where there were pieces and parts that were starting to fail. So this upgrade salvaged my machine and let me continue to use my machine in production. Have all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to it. So you can see here that what I've started with, I've removed my spoil board, gotten that out of the way just to reduce the weight of the machine a little bit for moving it around. I have disconnected all of the connections on the drag chain, including the Y motors. Those are both disconnected on both sides. The X and the Z motor are disconnected, and the entire wiring harness is free now. Down at the bottom here, I've removed the control box and disconnected all the wires from the control box. So there is one wire in the current wiring harness that I'll be saving, and you may or may not have this wire in your harness currently. When I bought my laser, I opened up my drag chains and I put my laser wire inside the drag chains. So I'm going to recover that laser wire from the drag chains and install it in the new drag chains. Also, on my current configuration, the power cord for my trim router, I had routed with the drag chains just simply by wire tying it onto the drag chains. So I've already cut all those off and that wire's free. The upgrade provides large enough drag chains that I'll be able to put the power cable for my router, the air tube for the air assist on my laser, and the laser control wire into the new drag chain. I'll be removing the spindle wire from the new drag chain because I don't use a spindle, I use a router. So I'm going to run the power cable instead of the spindle cable. And we'll set that spindle cable aside because we will need a use for it later on. So the first thing I'm going to do now is remove the router. And you want to take the entire router mounting off. These are number 4 hex heads. So you're just going to need a number 4 hex wrench. Loosen them up, take that off, get it out of the way. Once you have that off, just set your router and the mounting plate aside because you're going to come back to it later when we remount that. So a couple of parts you got to keep. There's a bracket right here that holds the front end of your drag chain and a bracket right here that holds the back end of your drag chain. On the back of the machine, there's a shelf that the drag chain rides on, 2 screws that hold that shelf onto the X-axis gantry. So you're going to want to keep those 2 screws, the plate that the drag chain sits on. You want to keep the back mounting plate and the front mounting plate for the drag chain. So I'm going to go ahead and take those off now. And I'm going to start with the X-axis drag chain because they're all connected with the wires. So you want to take it off around as you go. And these can be a little bit of a pain because all the wires are laying right over the top of the screw. And there's 2 screws here that hold it. So there's my X drag chain. There's the X drag chain disconnected, and it is still connected here to the Y axis drag chain. So now we're going to take the Y axis drag chain off at its high point. There is 1 cable that runs along the bottom of the shelf that goes over to the Y1 motor, and it is just kind of fed through a couple little tabs on the bottom. Pop that right out, and now your whole X-axis is free. You can push that, get it out of the way for the moment. Now I'm in a situation where my machine is broken, so my old controller and the old motors and this old drag chain are going to do me no good. So I'll be removing the laser wire out of here and salvaging that. But otherwise, for me, this piece is now mostly trash. If yours still works, your Nema 17 motors may be useful for DIYing some kind of another small CNC setup of one kind or another. So definitely hold on to all these parts. The controller's a good controller. There's nothing wrong with the Nema 17s for maybe another application. So hold on to those. For me, again, these are going to go away. I'm going to have to open up this drag chain and take my laser wire out of it. And I'll do that later off camera because it's not pertinent to the upgrade. So from the drag chain assembly, this ledge, and this ledge on the back all need to be kept. So we're going to remove those next. So this tray ledge on the back has a screw right here that mounts into the gantry plate, and there's one on the other side, and it is also the number 2. And there's your drag chain ledge. Set that aside. That's a part you do need to keep and reuse. Up top, this is next to your X motor. This is the top of the drag chain mounting. So your drag chain comes along here, loops around and connects right here. So we're going to take that off. Also 2 number 2s. So that is the complete drag chain assembly. The next thing I'm going to remove is going to be the drive belts. The drive belt system on this machine is a pretty straightforward machine, pretty straightforward system. You can see it's got a fixed nut which tightens it down into the groove. There's a screw through the front that allows you to squeeze this forward and backward for tension. And there's 2 screws here that have a plate that pinches the belt to hold the belt tight. So we're going to remove all 3 of those for both sides. This is a number 3. This is the tension. I'm going to move to the other end and do the same process. And now that my belt is loose, I can pull that belt right through and completely remove it from the machine. I'm going to hold on to this belt. You're going to want to hold on to this belt too. I am going to replace the belts during this process, but the current belt I can use as a measure to see how long my new belts need to be when I cut them. And there's the belt. Now both of my X-axis or my Y-axis rail belts are removed. This is completely free to roll at this point. So, and you'll find that there's going to be some dirt down in these grooves, probably some rubber wear along the edge. You're going to want to clean those up when we put this all back together. Next thing we're going to do is remove the X-axis belt. This is the exact same process, just on the X-axis. And there's my X-axis belt. We're going to hold on to that so I have something to measure my length off of. Next, I'm going to remove the X gantry. This is 2 screws on this side, 2 screws on the other side, and the X gantry will pop right up out of the gantry. Now, the X gantry is completely free, and you can pick that up and take it off, set it aside. Next, we're going to remove the rails, the Y rails, from the sides of the machine. So now I'm going to show a little close up here before I start the work. Next, we're going to do the Y axis rails, and we're going to remove those from the frame. So at each end, there are 4 screws, 2 screws that hold the rail, 2 screws that hold on to the frame. So to start with, we're going to take the 2 screws that hold the rail off both ends and get the rail off of here. This plate does get replaced, so we will need to take it off the frame too, but we're going to remove the 2 rails first, then we'll remove the frame plates. That way we can set the frame aside while we rebuild the rails. So let's get started on that. So now both Y rails are free from the frame. Just pop them out of there, set them aside. Now inside this Y rail, you have a T-nut that holds your belt tensioning system together. Save both those T-nuts. Be sure not to lose them. Same thing on this side. Take your T-nuts out. Set those aside. Be sure not to lose them. Keep them with all the belt tensioning hardware that you saved from the last step. Last thing we're going to do is remove the 4 plates from the frame. Once you have all 4 of those corner mounting plates out of the way, you can take your rigid frame. This is the frame that gives the entire machine its rigidity and assembles the entire process. There's also center points that keep your spoil board from sagging. There are feet on the bottom in 6 locations. So all 4 corners have feet and 2 feet in the center too. This also helps your spoil board from being able to sag in the middle when you're using it. But for right now, we can set this aside. So I'm going to start with the x-axis. I'll turn the camera down here a little bit. So most of the x-axis gets replaced. If you're following the instructions that, if you're following the recommendation that I gave at the beginning to replace all of these wheels, then some of this you won't have to do. Same thing for the Y rails. The Y rails, the limit switches on the Y rail, you'll need to take off, pull the wire through, and save that limit switch setup. But if you're putting new wheels on, you're done with this. You can take this off, get it out of the way, slide this off, and everything here is being replaced if you're putting new wheels on. If you're not putting new wheels on, you're going to have to disassemble these to salvage the wheels. I recommend that while you've got the machine this far apart, put new wheels on. They do wear. It's never a bad idea. They're about $20 a set, and I'll put some links for wheels and belts in the description of this video on YouTube. But for now, the Z-axis and the X-axis, there are some parts that need to be kept. So we're going to go ahead and take the 2 motors off first and get started there. You will be salvaging the Z limit switches and the X limit switches. Take the screws out of the X stepper and get that out of the way. To remove the X motor, once you have all the screws removed, you'll need to turn the motor until you see that set screw in there. Remove that set screw so that you can pull the shaft of the motor through the hole. The set screw is holding the gear on that prevents you from coming through. So remove that set screw and you'll be able to pop that gear off and get it out of the way. So to remove the Z motor, you're going to want to lower your Z axis manually down till you have access to the coupler. So there is a coupler in here that connects the Z motor to the lead screw that controls your Z axis. So you're just going to drop it down until you have access to the bottom set screw and the top set screw. Loosen those set screws, and now that you have this loose, you'll be able to take this off. I have those set screws on the Z-axis loosened. Now I'm going to loosen these 2 bolts at the top and remove the whole plate. And there's your Z-axis old motor. With that removed, you now have access to the 4 screws that hold the X-axis standoff for the motor. So we're going to remove that now. So with the majority of the disassembly done, there's still a little bit of disassembly left. Both the Y rails need to be disassembled and reassembled, and we're going to do those one at a time. We'll do the disassembly and the assembly. Same thing with the XZ rail. So most of the XZ rail is broken down already. This plate will be replaced, but we need to salvage the limit switches. So we're going to take those limit switches off and set those aside. And we don't even need to disassemble the wiring. All we need to do is take the 4 screws out, set it aside, take these 4 nuts out, and remove the plate. Also, over on the table here, I now have the box with all the parts, the new screws, bolts, nuts for the wheel assemblies. It did also come with all the tools you need, but I've been using my own, so those are set aside. Additionally, this is a box with all of the new screws for reassembling the whole kit and caboodle, so to speak. So let's get started with the XZ assembly. I'm going to start this process by removing the X limit switches. Take the whole thing, just set it aside. Next, we're going to loosen nuts that are the wheel mountings and the back plate. It's a number 8mm nuts. So you may need to turn your lead screw to drop this plate below your nuts on the back so you can get to those. And what you're doing is taking these top nuts all the way out, and that'll release the wheels. So this is actually threaded into this plate. The bottom ones are not, the top ones are. And do these a little at a time on each side, because what you're going to find is the nut will not come out right here because your linear rail is in the way, and you don't want to have to remove the linear rails. So just loosen one side, loosen the other side, keep working your way across so it stays even, and then those screws can stay right where they are. And once you have those backed all the way out, you'll be done with that plate, and that plate is being replaced. Now, you can lay this whole thing down backwards like this and just disassemble everything if you're going to replace the wheels. If you're not, I still recommend taking these apart, clean the wheels. I can see wear on these wheels, so this light spot around the edge, that's wear where it rides in the groove. So it was probably about time to replace my wheels anyway. All of the nuts, there are new nuts and new eccentric nuts for all of these. So, and I will show an example here in just a moment of what an eccentric nut is, but you have new wheel bushings and new eccentric nuts for every wheel in the system. So an eccentric nut allows you the ability to, let me show this, see if I can get a clear of this. You can see the center of that hole is just a little off from the center of the nut itself. So as you turn this nut, what it'll do is lift those wheels and lower those wheels, and that allows you to create a tighter clamp with the wheels around the bar. And after we reassemble this, we'll talk about how to adjust that, because you want it pretty tight, but you don't want it so tight that it hinders movement. If it hinders movement, you're too tight and you're going to wear the wheels faster. So we can pick this up and get it out of the way. While you've got this apart, these 2 tensioning pulleys, your belt runs through these pulleys up over the x-axis and back through the pulley. So while you got this apart, go ahead, grab a rag, clean those up real good. Also, flip this over Just make sure there's no gunk in your Z limit switches. Clean that up real good. And a good air blow out of this is always a good idea too. So let's go ahead and get started on reassembling the XZ axis. One of the things that can be an issue, these nuts, when you turn it over, are going to want to slide out. So something I'll recommend is putting just a piece of blue tape over the top of them. That'll help you a lot. So I'm going to do that. These top ones won't come out. The Z rails, or the Z linear rails, are in the way, but the bottom ones have a larger hole for where the eccentric nut slips in. So these want to slide out on you. So it's easy to just put a piece of blue tape. That way when you turn them over, they still stick out. So from the previous step, you should have saved your 4 eccentric nuts and the 4 bushings for the wheels. Take 2 of the bushings and put them on top. The eccentric nuts have one side is flat, the other side has a ridge on it. That ridge goes into the hole at the bottom of the screw. Slide your wheels on. This is a good time to put your rail on. With the Masuter Pro, where it says Masuter Pro is going to go on the Z side, and your tabs go to the top. So just work that on there, just set it down. They're not going to line up perfectly while it's laying down until you get that back rail on. Then you're going to slide your bushing nuts over the top of the top rails. And this time, your eccentric nuts on the bottom, the flange goes up because your new back plate has larger holes on the bottom to accept those. So now we're just going to slide this in place. And this is where you'll have to lift your rail a little bit and get those wheels, and now they'll line up for you. The kit does come with 4 new lock nuts for the XZ plate. So use the 4 new ones, because the 4 originals, the fiber locking ring in them is going to be worn from taking them in and out. So just give these, just get a thread start on them just to hold it together. Oh, and you do need, almost forgot, there are washers. There are 12 M5 12-1 washers. So you want 4 of these. And then your lock nuts. Always with lock nuts, remember the fiber ring on the lock nut goes to the outside. Now we're not going to tighten these down all the way and get rid of the blue tape, get that out of your way now. We're just going to snug these with the 8mm wrench. Just to make sure they don't fall apart on us while we work through the rest of this process. And at this point, you should be able to see that the groove lines up really well with the wheels on this side. So now, same thing for the bottom. while we're down here, something to note on the eccentric nuts. Each one of the eccentric nuts has a small line filed into it. That line shows you the lowest point on the eccentric hole in the nut. When you assemble this, it's a good idea to be sure that that line on all four of your eccentric nuts is all the way at the bottom. And that way you know that all the amount of play that's there is the most amount of play there can be. And we'll deal with snugging that up after we get the rest of this assembly together and the belt. So now that those are just snug, we're going to turn this over. So you can see this has got a nice free motion, and we're rolling perfectly centered in that groove. So we got our bushings in the right places. We got our eccentric nuts on here. Now what I want to do is lay this thing down and just kind of pull on it. Make sure there's not a lot of play in the carriage itself in those holes. And what you can do at this point is take a 10 millimeter, and those eccentric nuts will allow you to snug up those wheels to the actual rail, so that they are riding nice and snugly inside. And you can see now I've got that so tight that it actually rolls nice and slow. And that is even before I've got a belt and a motor on it. And that is probably a nice position right there. I am going to loosen those just a tiny bit, back them off just a little hair. And I can feel that that's still a really good motion. And there's no flat spots. Everything's rolling really well. So now that I have that, now I'm going to tighten up these lock bolts. And now we got a nice smooth motion on that, roll it up and down that rail. So now that assembly is ready to be put back together. Next thing we're going to do is the Z assembly. The Z assembly comes with a new plate for your Z motor, and that is going to mount right here. We've got 4 screw points, 2 here and 2 here. So from the new screw kit, these are M4 14s. We need 4 of these. I stand corrected. There are 2 M4 14s and 2 M5 14s. The M5s go in the top, the M4s go in the back. So we're going to start with the M5s in the back. Just finger snug that in. Finger snug that one in. And then the M4s in the top. And now we're ready for the Z-axis motor. So the new Z-axis motor already has the collar on it to mount to the Z-axis lead screw. Just want to make sure that's loosened up enough that you'll be able to get it on there. Slide it into place. So you can see that slides right over the top of that lead screw. And from your screw box, you're going to need 4 M410s. And now I'll go back. And before I tighten that up, I'm going to tighten up the collar inside. So what I see now that I've tightened up that collar is that I'm not engaged on that wheel. And there's a set screw spot on the back. So if you look where the motor is in the packaging, there is actually a set screw that fits in there. And now I'm moving my Z-axis. So make sure that set screw is nice and tight. I'm going to back up a minute because I did forget something and I want to mention this. We're going to take these 4 back out because something you should do before you put this motor in place. That collar has 2 set screws and 2 collar crimping screws. One goes on the shaft of the motor. The other one goes on the Z-axis lead screw. And we want to make sure that you're nice and tight to the shaft of the motor before you put this motor in, because once it's in, you can't get to those. You can see these 2, right? This one affixes to the shaft of the motor. Make sure it's nice and tight. And I'm going to tighten it up before I put this on, just in case. There is a lot of motor shaft in there. So I'm actually going to loosen it and drop it down on the motor shaft just a tiny bit, because I would like to see that collar make better engagement with the lead screw. So we're just going to loosen that collar, half a turn, loosen the set screw, about a half a turn, and you'll see there is also a flat spot on the shaft for the motor. Just want to pull that down just a little bit. Make sure your set screw is still on the flat spot on the motor shaft and tighten that up. Make sure that you got good connection on this collar to the Z-axis motor before you put it in place, because once it's in place, you don't have access to those 2 screws. You'll have to take it apart to tighten it back up. So do it before you put it together. Tighten up the collar. Tighten up the set screw. And this is one of those screws that I recommend putting as much torque as you can finger put on it with this little wrench without breaking it. Now, put this in place and start your M410s. Square this up as much as possible and just snug these down. You don't want to tighten them yet. Want to have a little bit of ability to move that motor a little bit, because now we want to tighten that motor collar. So now we're going to tighten that collar. Make sure your Z-axis is all the way to the bottom. Push it down because there is some play. It'll lift. So push it all the way to the bottom. You want the collar at the bottom of your Z-axis lead screw to sit flat on the bottom. And then tighten your collar. And you can see now, even before I tighten the set screw, I've got good connection with that Z-axis. So now I'm going to turn this around and we'll tighten up that set screw also. Now that also helps guarantee that you're straight all the way down the shaft before you tighten up your 4 mounting screws. So I got good motion on that. I can see it moves really cleanly. So I'm going to stand it back up, and now we'll torque those 4 mounting screws down. And work your way around. Go around twice, snug it up. Second time around, tighten it down. Kind of like you would with your lug nuts on a car. And if you want to take the time to do it, there's certainly no harm in putting some blue Loctite into these threads. Blue Loctite can be broken loose when you want to break it loose, but it'll hold everything nice and tight when you don't want it to break loose while it's in operation. And remember, these machines get a lot of vibration, a lot of motion. So a little bit of Loctite's not a bad idea. So now we got good motion on the axis. We got no play on the rail. So there's your Z-axis already reassembled. So now we're going to move on to the X-axis motor, the pulley, and your new belt. So this is your X-axis. You see it's already got the gear on there. What I'm going to do is slide it in here and get an idea of whether my gear is going to line up with the pulleys. And you can see that the gear that's on this motor is far too far forward. So we're going to have to move that gear back. There's a set screw on here. Same thing as the last ones. So we're going to loosen up these 2 set screws. Slide this in there. And just by eye to get started with, you can kind of line that up. Make sure that gear lines up with the pulley gears that are inside. And you can put just a half turn on here because we're going to fine tune it after we attach it. This is with the same M4 10s that we just attached the last one with. We'll get 4 of those out. We'll get the first 2 started. Now you can put this any way you want. I am going to put this with the wire to the side. On my old motors, there was a plug on the motor, so having it up was nice because you could just plug it down in. With the new motors, since they have a wire lead, I'm going to have it to the side so it's not sticking up where it can get bumped, crushed, things like that. So I've got 1 screw here started. This might be a little easier to do if you lay this down flat. And now that the motor and everything's mounted on it, it'll sit pretty stable for you. What you don't want is you don't want your wire down because you're going to have your drag chain and other things on the back. You don't want it to interfere with this wire. So to the side or to the top is fine. And now you're ready to align your pulley. So what you want to do here is make sure that your pulley, I'm going to roll this all the way to the end. So you can see the pulley on the motor in there is a little further forward than the tension pulleys. So we're going to slide that pulley back and forth, that gear back and forth on the motor shaft till we get it nice and lined up, and then we'll tighten down those set screws. So there's our new Z motor, our new X motor, the new wheels. Last thing we have to do is put a new belt on this. And I'm going to use the old belt to cut the new belt to give me an idea on what my length is. So the new belt I have is just a little bit stiffer, sturdier of a belt. It's got 5 wire reinforcements in it instead of the 3 that the normal belts have. All I'm going to do is stretch this out, make sure it's just a little longer than the original belt because we'll trim it when we're done. Grab a pair of scissors, cut that piece off. Next thing you're going to need is 2 of your tension points. So we're going to turn back to all the parts we salvaged earlier. And these are your tension plates. These fit right on top. And there is a T-nut that pops in here. So you're just going to slide these T-nuts in from the side, 1 on each end. We're going to take one of our tension points and one of our flat pinch connectors, and just get 2 of the screws started into, or 1 of the screws actually started into that, so you got a little bit of a hinge. Just like that. On these belts, the teeth go down. So you're going to start at this end, pull a little bit through, fold it over, just like that. And then we'll put a second screw on here and tighten it down. So this is what this will look like when you're done with it. Tighten that down as tight as you can get it on both sides. Take the screw that goes through the center of this hole and goes into the T-nut, put it in place, make sure you got the right Allen, and slide that T-nut down far enough that you can get contact with it. And don't tighten it, just get it started so that you still have free motion here. Next thing we're going to do is feed this through. So this is a process that's a pain in the butt. Get the old belt out of the way here. The further down you away from your belt you start, the better. Remember, your belt is going to go down under the wheel, under the pulley, over the gear, under the other 2 pulleys on the other side. This is a better visual representation of the proper path for the belt under the wheels, under the pulleys, and over the X-axis motor gear. Put your belt in so that you are in the slot all the way through on both sides of where your motor sits. With an Allen wrench, wedge it on the other side by the wheel and push this in, and it'll start creating a loop in there that you can now grab with another Allen wrench and start your pull through. So now you got a loop in there that can go up over the motor. Then all you got to do is push the far side between the motor pulley and snug it tight. And now you can see if I hold this belt tight, I've got the motion that I'm expecting to have. So now all we need to do is put our tensioning on this end and cut off the excess. So I'm going to put a little block in here, we'll lean it back, and let's put together the tension side on here. Same thing, through the hole. And you do not want this pulled all the way against the side. So you want some space between these two on both ends, because there's a screw that goes here that'll allow you to tension them. So on this end, I'm going to move it about 1/4 inch from the end, and I'm going to tighten that so that that one doesn't move. On this end, I'm going to put this in place, pull this out so that I see I have about 1/4 inch on this end. I'm going to put that flap over the top of it and put another screw in there, and then we'll have the belt tightened down. So that's about 1/2 inch, and I'm tight all the way through. I'm going to leave it right there and tighten this flap down that squeezes the belt and holds it to that belt tensioner. Next, I'm going to grab one of my T-nuts, slide it in there. Push that thing down far enough that you can get your screw down into it. Line that up and pull this whole thing snug. Doesn't have to be tight yet. So you can see there's a rolling motion here that's pretty snug. It's got good speed. So we're just going to put a little tension on that belt, and then our XZ axis will be done. This is a cap end screw that goes on here. Get your thread started on this end, and you'll see you'll have about 1/2 inch. Get your thread started on this end, and you'll also have about 1/2 inch on this end. Now, with these two set screws loose, you can tighten your tensioning screws till you get about 1/4 inch on each end, and your belt should be right at the top of your slot. So, and you can feel the tension in it. You don't want it so tight that it doesn't move at all, but you don't want to have any play in it either. And a good way to check is just make sure you got a nice smooth motion on this on its own. So that's got really good smooth motion. I got no play in this in any direction. So now I can tighten up the set screw on this end, tighten up the set screw on this end, I'm going to go back. The pinch points for these belts, you want to make sure they're nice and snug too. So we're going to give those one more quick. Just make sure that'll keep your belt from slipping. And then you can come back and trim this extra. I usually leave just about 1/4 of an inch on the end there. Reality is if you ever need to tension this, you're going to pull belt through. You're never going to need more belt. So just leave about 1/4 of an inch on each end, and that won't get in the way of your wheels because your limit switch will stop it before it hits that point. So now the last thing we have to do is turn this back over, and we're going to put our X limit switches back on. So get your X motor wire out of the way, put these limit switches in place, and just tighten those screws back in place. Make sure none of your wires came loose while you had it apart. Click them, make sure they still click. You've got a good solid mechanical click to them. And then you can roll this all the way through. Make sure your limit switch makes contact. I got good contact on this end and good contact on that end. So here we are with a completed XZ assembly. So this wraps up part 1 of the disassembly and the assembly of the XZ axis and the gantry. So in part 2, I'll cover the assembly of the Y1 and Y2 rails, and then the complete reassembly of the machine, the frame, and all of the wiring harness. So look forward to that coming soon.